Okay, we should start. Good morning, everybody. Well, very warm welcome to all of you. I know it's raining today, and sorry you have to come all the way here to attend this talk. We from the Singapore Environment Institute, your MC for today. Some of you might have known this. Singapore Environment Institute, or SEI in short, is the Training and Knowledge Division of the National Environment Agency. And since 2004, we have been organizing this series known as Professional Sharing Series, or PSS in short. Over 50 eminent experts, academics, policy leaders, industry experts have spoken at this platform. And this is one of our knowledge sharing platforms, so we seek to promote a dynamic exchange of environmental information and knowledge amongst NEA staff, industry professionals, our colleagues from public sector, businesses, and academics. I think by now we know that half of humanity, that is about 3.5 billion people, live in cities today. Energy demands, air quality, waste management, water issues are some of the many challenges faced by cities. However, there are also opportunities for cities to raise to the occasion and meet these challenges, balance its various needs, and of course, step off on an environmentally sustainable path for the future generations to come. I think all of us know Sydney City. I do not need to introduce Sydney City itself, but you may not be aware that the City Council itself is actually the first City Council in Australia to be certified carbon neutral. The city has also set forth this Sustainable Sydney Vision 2030 to make the city as green, global, and connected as possible. Today, we have with us Mr. Chris Derksema, the Sustainability Director at the City Council. He manages a multidisciplinary team responsible for developing and implementing policy, strategies, and programs to improve the environmental performance of the Council's operations in the community. He's also the very man who has been through the development and right now the implementation of the strategy, which includes the development of the Green Infrastructure Master Plan. He's no stranger to conferences and seminars. I think maybe the second or third time he's visiting Singapore. He has experience in green building design, environmental management systems, process engineering, and waste management. He's also the recipient of the Vincent Fairfax Leadership and Ethics Award. Given that he has been through the various stages of developing and implementing the vision, I think this is a very good opportunity for us to interact with him during Q&A later on. So without further ado, let's welcome Chris.
Morning all. Just so I know who's in the audience, who here works for government? And then private industry? Yeah, okay, so we've got quite a good mix actually. I'm going to start off where we started, probably quite a number of years ago. The development of Sustainable City 2030 was a very big task for the city. It was the largest engagement the city had ever undertaken. It was probably took a good 18 months of talking with industry, talking with residents, talking with business, talking with other government departments, talking some more and talking some more. And from that we got a very strong consensus actually. This is probably back in 2006, well it was back in 2006, so it was a time when the environment was very high on the agenda, and we got a very strong agreement from all those different stakeholders that they really wanted to see significant and urgent action on climate change. And as part of that, we set a new greenhouse gas reduction goal, which is 70% reduction by 2030 based on 2006 levels. Now, I know that the IPC and others always use 1990 as their baseline and go out to 2050. We picked numbers that we thought people could better understand. 2006, people actually knew what the city was like in 2006, and we've chosen the same trajectory as what we would have been if we were in 1990 out to 2050. So this is online with the 80% by 2050. Quite interesting though, I suppose with the recent, over the last couple of years, the new IPCC data is probably that we might have to even make this target even tighter next time we revise the target. So 70% reduction. At the time, we did some really preliminary work about how do we go about achieving that overall target. And this is what we call our waterfall chart. And on the left-hand side there, we have our 2006 emissions. And then we have business as usual, what we predicted business as usual to be in 2030. And then we had a suite of actions that we thought we could implement to get us down to the target of 70% reduction. And so you'll see there on the left-hand side in the pink is decentralised energy through trigeneration, and I'll talk more about that. We have waste to energy, a suite of energy efficiency technologies there, lighting technologies, minimum energy performance standards, car parking reductions actually in the city, which is minimises the amount of ventilation and lighting required in the city, transport issues, renewable energy, and then finally a housing strategy. If you lived in the city of Sydney, you would have an inherently lower footprint than if you lived out in the suburbs, out in broader metro Sydney. The thing here to note that we were very honest about is that we set the target based on the environmental outcome that we thought we were obligated to achieve. You know, the ethical, what's the right thing to do, and that was the 70% reduction. These are all the actions that we could put down on paper as pragmatic actions that we thought we could undertake, and that meant that we had a deficit. So we were really honest about saying all the things that we know that we can do now, that we can actually afford, that are implementable. If we did all of them, we're still going to be falling short of the target. And that was quite a tough kind of a thing for a politician, our Lord Mayor, to go and talk about publicly. But what it's done is really instilled a value of every time we do a project, every time we run a program, you know, every time we spend an hour of effort on some particular issue, we need to squeeze every last kilogram of carbon out of that project. And it's really made us, I suppose, aware of the magnitude of the problem as well. We, I suppose in simple terms, take a three-pronged approach to sustainability. We want to lead by example. We need to green council operations. We need to help the community to do the same, so that's all the residents, the businesses and the stakeholders in the city, the visitors as well. And then finally, transformational change through green infrastructure. I'm just going to talk about the second one first of all, which is this helping the communities to do the same. And I should say, before I get on to this, Sustainable Sydney 2030, I talked a little bit about the engagement. It is not just an environment strategy. It is actually at its core probably more a livable city economic development strategy. It has 10 major directions, and they cover everything from social, cultural, economic, also technology, and it's a big broad suite of objectives within that Sustainable City 2030 strategy. I'm responsible for the environment part of that, and I suppose the green part of green, global and connected. Global, green was supposed to be not only green from its environmental performance, but also green as a city. Just like, I suppose, you know, we've really taken heed of what's happening here in Singapore. I think you've done a fantastic job of physically greening your city with the plants and the trees and the canopy coverage, and so we've now been setting canopy coverage targets and those kind of things in Sydney as well. So greening the city, global in terms of its competitiveness economically, global in terms of its outlook as well, and connected socially, connected economically, connected with other cities as well. So I suppose it's a very easy catch cry, green, global and connected, but it was something that people could remember and relate to. When we do our, I suppose, planning around what are we going to do with the community, this is some of the cornerstone information that we use. So these are sort of the carbon emissions, the water emissions and the waste of the different sectors that we have within the city of Sydney. So you can see there that from a carbon emissions perspective, small and large business make up a major component of our greenhouse gas footprint, almost 3/4 there, or just over 3/4. Residential is quite, probably around 10%. Then we've got transport, which I think is about 7%, and waste is about 5%. Now, people often ask, well, why is transport so low? You know, is Sydney really good at it? It's not necessarily that we are so good at transport, it's that the energy source that we have for business is so bad. You know, we are predominantly a coal-fired electricity network, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. From a water use perspective there, we can see that residential is a much larger component there. We have a very big portion of high density residential, which is probably more like Singapore compared to many other councils in Sydney. And I should say, I work for the City of Sydney. We're not the whole of Metro Sydney. We are the central business district plus about 40 surrounding suburbs. We are about 8% of Australia's GDP, so we might be geographically quite small, but actually economically very strong. We have only about 180,000 residents within that area, but we have about 1 million visitors a day coming into the city, and most of the commercial development in the whole of Metro Sydney is in the centre of Sydney. And then you can see here waste to landfill. Commercial and industrial makes up a large portion. Residential is only at about 20%, and construction and demolition as well. So that just gives you a flavour. So commercial plays a really big role in the footprint, and therefore is a very big target for us in terms of our programs. So these are some of the programs, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, but the Better Buildings Partnership, and I'll talk about that, which focuses on commercial buildings. Cities, which focuses on the tenants within those buildings. The Smart Green Business, which is a small community business program, and we're converting that into version 2, and I'll tell you about that in a second, and also Big TO, which is the building owners as well. We also try and take advantage of the state and federal government programs. So if there's a grant available, if there's some sort of program that's already being run with federal or state governments, we really don't try and, you've got to try and stop to reinvent things. We just try and make sure that the residents or the businesses in the City of Sydney get the most out of those programs possible. So it's a facilitation role. This is just a slide on the Better Buildings Partnership. So when we had a look at the ownership structure of the commercial buildings in the city, we actually found that 14 property owners owned about 60% of the commercial office space in the city. So you had a very small number of players who owned a very large portion of the city. Many of these building owners are actually already experts in their field. So 6 out of the top 10 on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index are Australian property companies, all based in Sydney. So it's not really about teaching them how to be, environmentally more conscious. They already know a lot of this, and they've made a really strong business case out of it. What this is about is trying to bring them together as a group and say, how do we leverage that expertise? How do we do things with a group that we couldn't do individually? And how do we promote Sydney as a green brand, as a green city, and how will that ultimately, I suppose, increase the economic viability and the robustness of our city as well, and our ability to, I suppose, deal with changes in the future. So the Lord Mayor is obviously the head of that, and then we have the CEOs who get together once a year, and then we have a leadership panel between the different groups. We work on, and we have subcommittees on energy, water, waste, tenant engagement, and there's a whole suite of programs that are happening because of that. The other flip side to that is, and I suppose this is just to recognise and just give you a flavour, commercial buildings in the city, we have, there's a very big delineation between the building owner and the tenant. So the tenant pays their own outgoings most of the time in the Sydney office environment, so they pay for their own energy and the like. And so the tenant can actually influence about 50% of the greenhouse footprint of any commercial building. So tenants also, they tend to refurbish their tenancies more frequently, and it's actually very easy to make it quite an energy efficiency tenancy. So this program focuses purely on the tenants within those buildings. The other thing is because you got the building owners, there hasn't always been a very strong, I suppose a productive relationship between the building owners and the tenants, and having the council or the government come in and work with the tenants and actually be an independent voice has actually helped the relationship with those two parties to get better outcomes in the commercial building industry. So we have about, I think it's 16 or 17% of the commercial office space in the whole of Sydney in this program already, and that's growing year in year. The other one here is Smart Green Business. We started out actually with a grant from our water utility to help small business reduce water, and this is when our dams were quite low, they're at about 10%, and there was a really big push for water efficiency. We've had some really great wins with this, but small businesses, as you'd imagine, is quite difficult, very high transactional cost. You've got to very much handhold and work with them in a very strong way. And, but the results are there, and so we've got some good results, and I think the reason for that is that we did invest the time in going out and working with these businesses, and they're very time poor, so you need to really help them if you're going to get an outcome. The other side to this is a new legal arrangement called an environmental upgrade agreement. Do you want me to use the microphone? I can use that, it's fine. Okay.
Camera has to be
Fair enough. I'll speak lower and speak into the microphone. Environmental upgrade agreements. So this is a legal arrangement. So one of the issues has been what we call the split incentive. So the base building owner may be responsible for upgrading the lights and upgrading the building and making the building more environmentally perform better. But the person who benefits from all that is the tenant, and the tenant's not paying for it. So that's what we call the split incentive. So this is about trying to get around the split incentive and also get a cheaper cost of finance. So what happens is, instead of the building owner and the financier just having a relationship where the building owner goes and gets finance and upgrades their building, in this case, they still do that, but we have a tripartisan agreement where council also comes into that relationship, and instead of the building owner paying their money directly back to the finance provider, we take a charge off that building owner. So we charge that building owner, and then we pass that money back to the finance institution. And so what this does, it essentially makes it a super secured loan, because as a government, we have the first right of drawing funds from that building owner. So if they get into hardship or trouble, we can always draw funds off earlier. So we essentially take a first position in terms of the financing of that building. And what this does is it really lowers the risk for the finance provider, because they know they're always going to get their money back, and therefore they can provide a much cheaper rate of finance. And so we've done our first, this has only been in for a little while, we've done our first environmental upgrade agreement with a company called Fraser's Property Group, $26 million project, and they were saying they got financed at about half the rate they would have otherwise. So it's a very, very big influence, and that allows existing buildings to be upgraded. And the point here is that most of the buildings that are here now are going to be here still in 2030. So if we're going to have any impact on that 70% reduction goal, we need to be looking at existing buildings, absolutely. So the other part of this legislation is that the building owner can not only get cheaper finance, but they are also allowed to pass some of that charge, because it's a charge, onto the tenant as well, because the tenant has to pay government charges through their leases. But there's a litmus test there, and that is that the outgoings of the tenant can't be any more than what they would have been before. So if you do say a lighting upgrade in a tenancy, and they were previously paying $100 an hour or whatever for electricity, $100 a day, you've reduced their bill now to $60 a day, say, because you put more energy efficient lights in. You cannot charge them more than $40 for that charge. So you've got to make sure that they're not paying any more than they were before. And so that allows, and that gets over the split incentive, because the building owner can pass on some of the costs associated with upgrading these buildings. So there's a whole bunch of arrows in here, but essentially that's how that system works. And if you want to know more about that, just do a Google search on environmental upgrade agreements, and you'll be able to find them. The legislation does permit also this to happen in residential buildings, but we haven't quite got there yet. There's a few other sticky issues associated with that. Traditional council, core business, we also do a lot of environmental programs with residents, and so here's just a quick snapshot of all those sort of actions that we're doing with residents, running seminars. We have a Green Champions program. We focus on green apartments as well, which is, I suppose, particularly interesting for, should I go to a slide on that? Yeah, do. For Singapore. We also have power meters that we rent out, or people can borrow from the libraries to see what's using the energy within their households and those kind of things. And this was just a greenhouse that we had, that we used to take to many of the events that were happening in the city, and people could learn more about sustainability, and it had a lot of the elements of a sustainable housing. Green apartments, this is a program we've been running with about 30 buildings. We have about 700 or 800 high density residential buildings in the city, so it's only a first step, but the results have been extremely positive. What